The ventilation shaft in the underground bunker at Rabaul carried more than just air that February morning in 1944. It brought with it the steady drone of American bombers, a sound that had become as routine and predictable as the tropical sunrise itself. Vice Admiral Junichi Kusaka sat at his desk, pen hovering over his private journal, knowing that the words forming in his mind could cost him everything if they were ever discovered by the authorities back in Tokyo. His hand shook, not from fear of the bombers overhead, but from the terrible clarity of understanding that had been growing in his mind over the past months. The Americans were not fighting them. That much had become clear. They were doing something far more insidious, far more devastating. They were strangling the empire, cutting off its air supply, watching it slowly suffocate. Each garrison the enemy forces sailed past represented another stone tied to the neck of Japan, dragging the entire nation deeper beneath the waves. Kusaka could hear those liberators making their daily run, systematic and methodical, never bothering to vary their approach because there was no need. Rabaul was not a target anymore. It was a curiosity, a museum piece, a testament to obsolete thinking. 100,000 Japanese troops occupied this volcanic island. These were not raw recruits or garrison soldiers of questionable quality. These were the cream of the imperial forces, the finest warriors the army and navy had produced. They sat here, weapons at the ready, fortifications perfect, discipline unbroken, watching helplessly as American task forces steamed past their positions heading northwest toward the home islands. The great fortress of Rabaul transformed over years into the most formidable defensive position in the entire South Pacific, complete with a major fleet anchorage and everything required to support large-scale operations, was being methodically rendered impotent without a single enemy soldier setting foot on its beaches. What terrified Kusaka more than any frontal assault or naval bombardment was this new form of warfare he was witnessing. It rendered everything the Japanese military had prepared for completely irrelevant. The Americans were refusing to play by any recognizable rules. They showed no interest in glorious battle, no desire to test themselves against Japanese steel and spirit. Instead, they were dismantling the empire through what could only be called calculated neglect, transforming strength into weakness, turning fortresses into prisons, converting the best defensive positions into death traps. The mathematics of defeat were being written in a language Japan's military leaders refused to acknowledge. The casualty lists remained relatively light, which should have been encouraging, but Kusaka understood that this metric meant nothing anymore. The real numbers told the story. Shipping manifests that would never arrive at their destinations. Airfields that would never again see a Zero fighter take off on combat operations. Soldiers who would not die from American bullets but from malaria, dengue fever, starvation, and the psychological corrosion of knowing they no longer mattered to anyone. The defensive strategy for the Pacific had been conceived in the imposing halls of Imperial General Headquarters with the kind of symmetrical elegance that appealed to the military mind. Staff officers had worked out the details with great care, creating what they believed was an impregnable barrier. Each island fortress would function as an unsinkable aircraft carrier, an immovable gun platform. Each garrison represented a blade pointed directly at any American advance, forcing the enemy to assault these positions one by one, bleeding themselves to exhaustion against Japanese determination and superior fighting spirit. The man running the government in Tokyo had proclaimed in September 1943 the establishment of what he called the Absolute National Defense Zone. This perimeter stretched from the southern reaches of Sakhalin and the Kuril Islands down through the Bonins and Marianas, across to western New Guinea, and back through Malaya and Burma. Every strong point within this zone would be held to the last man, every island transformed into a fortress of steel and concrete, every metre of ground purchased with enemy blood. The Americans would have to pay dearly for every advance, or so the thinking went. At Rabaul, General Hitoshi Imamura commanded 50,000 elite troops of the 8th Area Army, and these numbers represented only half the total garrison. The harbour installations bristled with 367 anti-aircraft guns of various calibers. 5 separate airfields could launch hundreds of aircraft simultaneously if required. The complex included strips the Australians had built before the war, Lakunai and Vunakanau, now greatly expanded and improved. Rapopo had been operational since December 1942, boasting concrete run-up areas, extensive runways, and maintenance facilities that would have been the envy of many bases in Japan itself. Tobera had been completed just the previous August. Miles of tunnels connected defensive positions carved from the volcanic rock, creating an underground city complete with hospitals and supply depots that could sustain operations indefinitely. General Imamura had written to Tokyo with complete confidence in November 1943. His message was unambiguous. Rabaul was impregnable. The Americans would shatter themselves against these defences like waves breaking against a sea wall. There would be no possibility of successful invasion. What neither Imamura nor the staff officers back in headquarters understood was that the Americans had absolutely no intention of providing them with their longed-for glorious battle. They were preparing to do something entirely different. The revelation began in what initially appeared to be a Japanese victory. When American forces landed on Woodlark and Kiriwina Islands on the last day of June 1943, commanders throughout the region felt a surge of satisfaction. These islands were barely defended at all. The Americans were clearly avoiding real combat, showing they lacked the stomach for serious fighting. Captain Toshio Takahashi, serving as intelligence officer at Rabaul, prepared an analysis that reflected the prevailing opinion. The enemy was nibbling at the edges like mice, afraid to face the lion. But something about the pattern disturbed Takahashi, even as he wrote his confident assessment. The Americans were not just taking targets of opportunity or seizing weakly defended positions. They were specifically, methodically choosing islands where airfields could be constructed. Woodlark and Kiriwina were perfectly positioned to provide air cover for operations that had nothing to do with those islands themselves. They were stepping stones, not destinations. The more Takahashi studied the map, the more his confidence began to erode. His disquiet deepened when American forces invaded New Georgia on June 30th. The Japanese had committed over 10,000 troops to defend this island, concentrated around the vital airfield at Munda Point. Finally, here was a real battle, a proper test of arms. The fighting lasted through July and into August, savage and brutal, exactly the kind of combat Japanese doctrine anticipated. When the Americans secured the airfield, Japanese commanders expected them to pursue the retreating forces, to clear the entire island, to achieve complete victory. Instead, the Americans stopped. They consolidated their hold on Munda, began building up the airfield facilities, and then moved on to other objectives. They left Japanese survivors scattered across the rest of the island, alive but effectively out of the war. Major Kenji Hatano, who survived the campaign and made it back to Rabaul, delivered a report that unsettled everyone who heard it. The Americans fought differently than expected. They took what they needed and left everything else behind. It was as if the Japanese forces themselves did not matter to them, as if they were obstacles to be worked around rather than enemies to be destroyed. By November 1943, anyone paying attention could see the pattern emerging with horrifying clarity. Operation Cartwheel, as the American offensive was designated, was not aimed at capturing Japanese bases in the traditional sense. Its purpose was to make those bases irrelevant, to transform them from threats into burdens, to turn every garrison into a drain on resources rather than a projection of power. Admiral Minichi Koga, Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet, responded to the Allied invasion of Bougainville on November 1st by making a fateful decision. He transferred carrier aircraft to Rabaul, 173 of Japan's most precious combat planes. 82 Zero fighters, 45 Type 99 dive bombers, 40 Type 97 torpedo bombers, 6 reconnaissance aircraft. These planes came from the carriers Zuikaku, Shokaku, Zuiho, Junyo, Hiyo, and Ryuho. More critically, they brought with them Japan's last trained carrier pilots, the irreplaceable veterans who had attacked Pearl Harbor, savaged the British Eastern Fleet off Ceylon, fought at Midway. These men represented the sharp edge of Japanese naval aviation, and now they were being committed to defending a base the Americans had already decided not to attack. The American response was swift and utterly devastating. On November 5th, carrier aircraft from Saratoga and Princeton struck Rabaul, heavily damaging 4 heavy cruisers and 2 light cruisers. 6 days later, they returned with reinforcements, Essex, Bunker Hill, and Independence joining the assault. They damaged most of the remaining warships in the harbour. But what happened next began the psychological unravelling of every Japanese commander in the region. The Americans did not invade. They did not follow up their advantage with amphibious landings. They simply sailed away, having destroyed 121 of the 173 carrier aircraft and killed 82 of the irreplaceable aircrew. They had accomplished their mission and saw no need to occupy the base itself. Commander Yasuo Kuwahara, a Zero pilot who survived the November battles, wrote in a letter that was discovered after the war. He tried to understand what had happened. The Japanese forces had won in the tactical sense. They had driven off the American carriers. So why did it feel like a defeat? The enemy had damaged ships, shot down planes, and then departed. There was no way to chase them, no way to strike back. All the Japanese forces could do was wait for the Americans to return whenever they chose, knowing there was nothing that could be done to prevent it. Lieutenant Commander Toshikazu Omai served as senior staff officer of the Southeast Area Fleet, and he began keeping meticulous records of what the bypass strategy meant in practical terms. His classified reports, captured after the war, provide a mathematical progression of strategic strangulation that is almost unbearable to read. In November 1943, Rabaul was receiving 30,000 tons of supplies each month. Fuel reserves stood at 60% of capacity. Ammunition stocks were adequate for 6 months of sustained combat operations. Everything appeared manageable. By December, supply convoys were becoming increasingly difficult to run. American submarines were achieving a devastating ratio, sinking 2 vessels for every one that successfully reached port. Monthly deliveries had dropped to 18,000 tons, a significant decline, but not yet catastrophic. January 1944 marked a turning point. No surface vessels had reached Rabaul in 3 weeks. Submarine deliveries were all that got through, and they could only manage 2,000 tons for the entire month. Fuel reserves had fallen to 30%. By February 1944, the High Command made the decision to stop provisioning Rabaul with fighters or bombers altogether. They recognized, finally, the futility of reinforcing an isolated garrison that could no longer influence the broader campaign. The mathematics were inexorable and unforgiving. Without supplies, even the mightiest fortress becomes nothing more than an elaborate prison for its own defenders. Captain Takeo Takagi commanded a destroyer squadron at Rabaul and faced an equation with no good solution. He had fuel for perhaps one major sortie, one significant operation. But where would he go? What would he accomplish? The Americans had taken the Admiralty Islands in February, completing Rabaul's encirclement. Every direction led to waters the enemy controlled. His forces were a fleet that could not sail, warriors who could not fight. They had become military theatre, maintaining the pretense of threat while the real war passed them by, ships in bottles, dangerous in theory but harmless in practice. What the Americans had discovered, whether through brilliant strategic planning or fortunate accident or some combination of both, was that Japanese island garrisons could be defeated by the Pacific itself. Each bypassed island became a green hell where the jungle, tropical disease, and starvation accomplished the work of multiple infantry divisions. The enemy did not need to land troops when nature itself would do the killing. Dr. Shigaki Yamauchi served as chief medical officer at Rabaul and documented the slow dissolution of combat effectiveness with clinical precision. In December 1943, malaria cases were increasing, but medical supplies remained adequate. Quinine reserves would last 4 months. Combat readiness stood at 85%. By March 1944, 30% of the garrison was suffering from malaria, dengue fever, or dysentery. The quinine was exhausted. Medical personnel were attempting to use local bark substitutes with limited effectiveness. Combat readiness had fallen to 60% and was declining steadily. The Americans had weaponized time itself. Every day that passed weakened the Japanese garrisons, while American forces grew stronger, leaping from island to island like stones, skipping across water, building airfields and ports, creating an entire infrastructure of victory, while Japanese strongholds rotted in tropical isolation, cut off from everything that made them militarily relevant. On Wake Island, bypassed since October 1943, Captain Shigematsu Sakaibara commanded approximately 4,000 Japanese troops. The atoll had once served as a vital refueling point for trans-Pacific flights, and it had been transformed into a fortress bristling with coastal guns, anti-aircraft weapons, and underground bunkers. The Americans simply ignored it, sailing past as if it did not exist. Sakaibara's reports to Tokyo, transmitted using radio equipment delivered by submarine at great risk, grew increasingly desperate in tone. In November 1943, he reported that enemy carrier aircraft had struck installations and that his forces were awaiting the invasion force, all positions manned and ready for the assault. By January 1944, no invasion had materialized, and enemy ships were passing by weekly, beyond the range of coastal guns. He requested instructions on what to do. By April, his food situation had become critical. Fishing provided some relief, but was insufficient for the garrison. Many men were showing signs of malnutrition. The question that haunted every report was simple and unanswerable. When would relief come? On Woleai Atoll in the Caroline Islands, 6,426 Japanese troops under Major General Katsumi Kitamura experienced similar abandonment. The Americans had seized nearby islands to build airfields, but left Woleai's garrison to wither on the vine. Kitamura's diary, recovered after the war, chronicles psychological disintegration in real time. On March 31, 1944, he wrote that the enemy task force had sailed past again that day, close enough to observe through binoculars but beyond reach of the guns. The Americans did not even consider them worth destroying. By May 15th, he had received a radio message stating that all available forces were being concentrated for a decisive battle. His garrison was not included in these plans. They had become military orphans, forgotten children of a dying empire. By August 2nd, the men had begun cultivating gardens, and Kitamura feared they were becoming farmers rather than soldiers, losing their warrior identity to the demands of mere survival. The American carrier raids that periodically struck bypassed bases served purposes beyond simple military damage. They were psychological operations designed to remind Japanese garrisons of their complete helplessness. At Truk, which Japanese strategists considered the Gibraltar of the Pacific, approximately 27,000 troops and the Fourth Fleet had created what was supposed to be an impregnable bastion. On February 17th and 18th, 1944, during Operation Hailstone, the Fast Carrier Task Force conducted massive air raids that destroyed over 250 aircraft, sank 2 light cruisers, 4 destroyers, and 32 merchant ships totaling 200,000 tons. 4,500 Japanese personnel were killed in 2 days of devastating attacks. Vice Admiral Masami Kobayashi commanded at Truk and experienced a commander's worst nightmare, which was not defeat but irrelevance. His report to Combined Fleet Headquarters revealed the psychological impact more clearly than any casualty list. The American carriers had appeared from nowhere, struck with overwhelming force, and vanished. There was no possibility of pursuit, no way to retaliate. The defenders could only endure and repair the damage, knowing with complete certainty that the enemy would return whenever they chose. This was not warfare in any recognizable sense. It was torment, systematic and deliberate. The pattern repeated itself across the Pacific with numbing regularity. Marcus Island, Palau, Yap. Each received attention from American carriers just often enough to prevent any coherent defense planning, never enough to provide the honorable battle that Japanese commanders desperately craved. The strikes were timed to maximize uncertainty and minimize any possibility of Japanese adaptation. The fall of Saipan in July 1944 provided the most devastating proof of the island-hopping strategy's effectiveness. When American forces invaded on June 15th, they brought overwhelming force. Over 300,000 men loaded into more than 500 ships. But what terrified Japanese strategists was not the assault on Saipan itself. It was the realization of how many fortresses the Americans had simply refused to assault, how many powerful garrisons they had written off as not worth the effort. Lieutenant General Yoshitsugu Saito commanded the defense of Saipan and received his last situation report on July 6, 1944, before ordering the final banzai charge that would kill him and most of his remaining men. That report catalogued the paralysis of the Empire's forces across the Pacific. Truk held 27,000 troops, isolated, with no possibility of naval support. Rabaul held 100,000 troops, similarly isolated, reduced to growing vegetables in an attempt to stave off starvation. Wake held 4,000 troops, surviving on fishing. Marcus held 4,000 troops facing critical water shortages. Walaai held over 6,000 troops with starvation imminent. More than 200,000 Japanese troops, equipped with thousands of tons of ammunition, hundreds of aircraft, and elaborate fortifications that had cost fortunes to construct, sat completely helpless while American forces drove toward the home islands. These were not casualties in any traditional sense. They were something worse. They were military assets that had been transformed into liabilities, strength converted into weakness through strategic judo. When Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kuribayashi arrived at Iwo Jima in June 1944, he brought with him a revolutionary understanding born from careful observation of the island-hopping campaign. He immediately recognized that Iwo Jima could not be held indefinitely. The Americans would surely invade this island on their route to the mainland of Japan, and the timing of their assault would be very soon. Unlike his predecessors who planned for victory, Kuribayashi planned for the most effective defeat possible. He had studied carefully what happened to bypassed garrisons and understood the strategic calculus with perfect clarity. Rather than establishing defences on the beaches to contest landings directly, he opted for defence in depth. He ordered the construction of 18 kilometres of tunnels and 5,000 cave positions beneath the island's volcanic rock. In a letter to his wife that would only be delivered after his death, Kuribayashi explained his strategy with brutal honesty. He was not fighting to win because victory was impossible. He was fighting to make the Americans pay such a price that they would think twice before invading Japan itself. Every Marine killed on Iwo Jima was one who could not participate in the invasion of the homeland. The garrison was not defending this worthless volcanic rock. They were defending Japan with their deaths, buying time with blood. This represented a fundamental shift in Japanese military thinking, an acknowledgement that the old ways had failed completely. Kuribayashi explicitly forbade banzai charges until the final days of the battle, considering them wasteful and tactically counterproductive. He ordered every soldier to take 7 enemy lives before being killed, to fight from prepared positions as long as possible. The island-hopping strategy had taught Japanese commanders that heroic death meant absolutely nothing if it did not serve a strategic purpose, if it did not impose costs on the enemy that affected their willingness to continue the war. What Japanese commanders were slowly, painfully realizing was that the Americans had revolutionized warfare itself. The island-hopping strategy was not just about avoiding strong points or conserving resources. It was about creating an entirely new form of military logistics that made traditional defensive positions obsolete. Commander Chihaya Takahashi served as a staff officer who analyzed American operations with increasing alarm. He wrote a report that was immediately suppressed by Imperial headquarters because it was too disturbing, too defeatist in its implications. The Americans did not capture islands in the traditional sense, Takahashi argued. They created floating bases, mobile infrastructure that moved with their fleet. Each captured atoll became a fuel depot, each lagoon a protected anchorage, each airstrip a projection of power that could reach hundreds of miles in every direction. They had transformed the Pacific Ocean itself into a highway for their war machine, and Japanese fortresses were simply buildings beside this highway, dangerous perhaps if approached directly, but easily bypassed by traffic that chose a different route. The Liberty ship program was producing 3 vessels per day at peak production. While Japanese garrisons carefully rationed their last tons of rice, American construction battalions were pouring concrete for runways that could handle bombers weighing 100 tons. The scale of American industrial mobilization was almost incomprehensible to Japanese officers trained in a resource-poor island nation. Captain Minoru Genda, the tactical genius who had planned the Pearl Harbor attack, studied American logistics from his post in Tokyo and reached a conclusion that was as chilling as it was accurate. Japan had prepared for a war of warriors, he realized. The Americans were fighting a war of engineers and logisticians. While Japanese forces perfected the art of dying gloriously, American forces were perfecting the art of supply, delivery, construction, maintenance. Each bypassed garrison weakened Japan, while each new airfield strengthened America. Time itself had become the enemy, every passing day tilting the balance further toward inevitable defeat. Complementing the island-hopping strategy was the American submarine campaign that turned Japanese resupply efforts into suicide missions. By 1944, American submarines were sinking Japanese vessels faster than shipyards could replace them. Admiral Naokuni Nomura commanded submarine operations from Truk and documented the impossibility of supporting bypassed garrisons. In January 1944, he lost submarine the Pry 169 while attempting to resupply the Bougainville garrison. 40 tons of supplies lost with the boat. February brought the damaging of I-43 by aircraft while approaching Rabaul. The mission aborted. March saw I-42 sunk while attempting to evacuate key personnel from Wake Island. By April, submarine resupply missions were suspended indefinitely because the command could not justify losing irreplaceable submarines for minimal supply delivery. The submarines that had once been the lifeline for bypassed garrisons had become too precious to risk. Each isolated fortress was truly, completely alone. The Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944 demonstrated the fatal consequences of the island-hopping strategy on Japanese naval aviation with devastating clarity. Japan had already sacrificed 121 of its 173 veteran carrier pilots defending Rabaul, stripping the carrier fleet of the expertise that made it effective. When Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa led the mobile fleet into battle on June 19th, he commanded 9 carriers with approximately 450 aircraft crewed mostly by inexperienced pilots with minimal training. The resulting engagement became known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Japanese losses were catastrophic: 550 to 645 aircraft destroyed, 3 fleet carriers sunk including Taiho, Shokaku and Hio, approximately 3,000 personnel killed. American losses were 123 aircraft and 109 men killed. The 10-to-1 kill ratio reflected not just American technological superiority, but Japanese degradation resulting directly from the bypass strategy's dispersal of veteran pilots to defend bases that no longer mattered. In his after-action report, Ozawa wrote with stark honesty that they had sent their finest warriors to die defending worthless rocks while losing the decisive battle that could have changed the war's course. The island-hopping strategy had not just bypassed Japanese positions. It had successfully dispersed and destroyed Japanese military effectiveness across thousands of miles of ocean. By mid-1944, a surreal transformation was occurring across the bypassed Japanese garrisons. Elite combat units, trained for years in the most demanding martial traditions, were becoming agricultural communes struggling simply to survive. On Rabaul, General Imamura issued orders that would have seemed like madness 2 years earlier. Effective immediately, all units would devote 50% of daylight hours to food production. Each soldier was required to cultivate 100 square meters of vegetables. Unit commanders would be evaluated based on agricultural yield rather than combat readiness. Imamura ordered fields to be cultivated and harvests accumulated, recognizing that the Americans had chosen blockade over invasion, starvation over battle. The fortress of Rabaul, constructed to threaten Allied operations across thousands of square miles of Pacific Ocean, had become nothing more than a vast prison farm. Colonel Norio Kishimoto commanded an infantry regiment and wrote in his diary that his samurai ancestors would weep to see what had become of their descendants. Men who had trained to die gloriously in battle were now tending sweet potatoes and raising chickens for eggs. The Americans had not just defeated them in military terms. They had humiliated them with irrelevance, reducing warriors to farmers, turning soldiers into peasants. Similar scenes played out across the Pacific with depressing consistency. On Wolei, soldiers raised pigs in improvised pens. On Truk, they fished with nets woven from parachute cord and whatever else could be scavenged. On Wake, they attempted to grow vegetables in coral sand mixed with human waste, trying to create soil where none existed. The Imperial Japanese Army, which had conquered half of Asia in a stunning display of military prowess, had been reduced to subsistence farming on isolated atolls, watching the war sail past. Perhaps the cruelest aspect of the entire island-hopping strategy was that it took months or even years for bypassed commanders to fully comprehend their situation. Radio contact with Tokyo continued, maintaining the illusion of connection. Orders were still issued as if these garrisons could execute them. Promotions were still announced, creating the pretense that careers continued to advance. The fiction of military relevance was carefully maintained even as reality diverged completely from any reasonable expectation. General Imamura at Rabaul continued receiving operational orders from Imperial General Headquarters as late as December 1944. These directives instructed him to prepare for coordinated offensive operations in conjunction with the Philippine campaign, to maintain readiness to interdict enemy supply lines. The absurdity of such orders, asking a garrison that had not seen a supply ship in 8 months to conduct offensive operations against enemy supply lines, reveals the complete disconnection between perception in Tokyo and reality on these isolated islands. By April 1944, the last Japanese submarine had fled Rabaul, unwilling to risk destruction in what had become an untenable anchorage. The last surface vessel had departed months earlier. No aircraft had taken off in over a month, and the magnificent airfields sat empty, grass beginning to reclaim the runways that had cost so much to construct. By early 1945, the bypass strategy evolved into its cruelest phase yet. American forces began periodically bombing the agricultural efforts of bypassed garrisons. B-24 bombers struck the gardens that desperate soldiers had cultivated over months of backbreaking labour. Fighter sweeps machine-gunned the fishing boats that represented the only source of protein for thousands of men. Even the attempt at mere survival was being deliberately thwarted. Lieutenant Hiroshi Yamaguchi served as agricultural officer at Wolei and recorded the impact of one such raid. 6 months of work had been destroyed in 10 minutes. The corn they had nursed from precious seeds, the vegetables they had watered using their own drinking rations, everything was burning. The Americans had not bombed gun positions or ammunition dumps or any legitimate military target. They had bombed the food supply. They knew exactly what they were doing, and Yamaguchi understood the message being sent. When Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender on August 15, 1945, approximately 300,000 Japanese troops remained scattered across bypassed islands throughout the Pacific. At Rabaul alone, 69,000 Japanese troops remained when the war ended. These men had survived not through combat, but through cultivating gardens, fishing in dangerous waters, and slowly starving while maintaining military discipline and the pretense of readiness. The surrender created a profoundly surreal situation for these forgotten garrisons. Many did not believe the announcement, convinced it was American propaganda designed to trick them into revealing their positions. Others, even believing the surrender was genuine, had no way to actually surrender because they were on islands with no American presence whatsoever. The enemy had bypassed them so thoroughly that there was literally no one to accept their surrender. Colonel Masashi Yamamoto commanded forces on Mili Atoll in the Marshall Islands and faced this bizarre dilemma. The war was over, but there was no one to surrender to. The Americans had bypassed his garrison so completely that they apparently had forgotten it even existed. His forces would have to wait patiently for the victors to remember them and send someone to accept their capitulation. Some garrisons waited weeks or even months before American forces arrived to formally accept their surrender. During this strange limbo period, they existed in a state that defied description, no longer at war, but not yet at peace, still maintaining military discipline and hierarchy, while knowing it meant nothing, still following orders from an empire that no longer existed. Admiral Chester Nimitz, architect of the Central Pacific Campaign, later reflected on the island-hopping strategy with evident satisfaction. The Americans had learned, he explained, that the quickest way to defeat Japan was frequently to avoid fighting the Japanese entirely. Every bypassed island represented thousands of soldiers who did not have to be killed in costly assaults, tons of ammunition that did not have to be expended, American lives that did not have to be sacrificed. The strategy had turned Japanese strength against itself in the most efficient way possible. General Douglas MacArthur, though initially resistant to bypassing major targets because it offended his sense of how war should be conducted, eventually recognized the strategy's brilliance. The decision to bypass Rabaul in particular saved enormous Allied casualties that would have resulted from assaulting such a heavily fortified position. Even MacArthur, with his considerable ego and preference for dramatic military operations, could not argue with results that advanced Allied objectives while minimizing friendly losses. But perhaps the most telling assessment came from within the Japanese command structure itself. Admiral Matome Ugaki served as Chief of Staff of the Combined Fleet and kept a detailed personal diary throughout the war. In February 1945, he wrote an entry that captured the essence of Japanese despair. The Americans had discovered the perfect strategy against the Japanese warrior spirit, he realized. They had made courage irrelevant, fortifications useless, the entire code of Bushido meaningless. Japanese forces had prepared to die gloriously in battle. The Americans had sentenced them to live shamefully in isolation and irrelevance. This was worse than military defeat. This was erasure, the negation of existence itself. The mathematics of the island-hopping strategy reveal its devastating effectiveness with brutal clarity. At Rabaul, 100,000 troops initially garrisoned the fortress, with 69,000 surviving to surrender. Truk held approximately 27,000 troops throughout the bypass period. Wolai held 6,426 troops, with only 1,650 surviving to surrender, the rest claimed by disease and starvation. Wake held 4,000 troops. Marcus held another 4,000. Various other garrisons scattered across the Pacific held tens of thousands more. In total, an estimated 300,000 Japanese troops were neutralized without major combat operations, converted from military assets into burdens on an already overstretched empire. Of the 26 major Japanese bases that were bypassed, not a single one managed to significantly interfere with American operations after being isolated. The strategic success rate was 100%, a clean sweep that justified the approach beyond any possible criticism. The island-hopping strategy's greatest success was not military in the traditional sense, but psychological. It shattered the fundamental assumptions of Japanese military doctrine at every level. Japanese strategy had always aimed for the decisive battle where spiritual superiority would overcome material disadvantage, where fighting spirit would compensate for industrial weakness. The Americans refused to provide such opportunities. Japan had spent decades fortifying Pacific islands, investing enormous resources in creating impregnable positions. The Americans demonstrated that fortifications only matter if someone actually attacks them, and that the best response to a fortress is often to simply ignore it. Japanese military culture glorified death in combat as the highest honor, the ultimate expression of loyalty and martial virtue. The Americans sentenced garrison troops to survival in irrelevance, denying them even the cold comfort of meaningful sacrifice. Japanese doctrine held that superior will could overcome material disadvantage, that determination could defeat industrial capacity. The Americans made will itself irrelevant by refusing to engage in the kind of warfare where will mattered. Captain Yoshitaka Shindo served as intelligence officer on bypassed Marcus Island and wrote what may be the most perceptive analysis of the entire campaign. Japanese forces were prepared for American strength, he acknowledged. They were prepared for American technology and firepower. What they were not prepared for was American indifference. The enemy had found the one thing that Japanese warriors could not fight against, which was being ignored, being dismissed as not worth the effort of destruction. By late 1944, some Japanese commanders began to understand and adapt to this new reality, but the hour was far too late for such learning to matter. Lieutenant General Kuribayashi at Iwo Jima had studied the island-hopping campaign carefully and designed his defense accordingly, not to achieve victory, but to impose maximum cost, to make the price of taking the island so high that Americans would reconsider invading Japan itself. His approach represented complete rejection of traditional tactics. No banzai charges that wasted lives for no purpose. No attempts to hold beaches where defenders would be slaughtered by naval gunfire. Instead, fighting from elaborate tunnel systems where every position had to be reduced individually, where every cave became a fortress requiring flame and explosives to clear. The defense extended what should have been a 5-day battle to 36 days of savage fighting, inflicting nearly 26,000 American casualties, including 68,221 killed. General Holland Smith, who commanded the operation, called Kuribayashi the most redoubtable of all Pacific adversaries, the most dangerous and effective enemy commander he had faced in the entire war. Similarly, the defense of Okinawa in 1945 showed Japanese adaptation to the brutal lessons learned from the island-hopping campaign. Instead of attempting to defeat the invasion, defenders sought to make it so costly that America would abandon plans for invading the home islands and seek negotiated peace instead. The strategy failed to achieve its objective, but it demonstrated that Japanese military thinking had evolved in response to American methods, even if that evolution came too late to matter. The greatest irony of the island-hopping strategy was that it used Japan's own dedication and discipline against itself. Every bypassed garrison that refused to surrender, every soldier who chose death over dishonor, every commander who followed orders to hold at all costs became a self-imposed prisoner. The Americans expected many bypassed garrisons to collapse quickly once supplies ran out, but Japanese discipline and ingenuity allowed many to survive far longer than anticipated through cultivation of gardens and cooperation with local populations when possible. This survival, which might have been seen as admirable resilience under other circumstances, instead prolonged suffering and irrelevance. General Imamura, reflecting on the experience after the war, observed that Japanese forces had trapped themselves with their own code. Surrender was culturally impossible. Retreat was explicitly forbidden. So they remained in place while the Americans simply bypassed them. The enemy did not need to defeat these garrisons. Japanese forces defeated themselves through inability to adapt to a strategy that rendered traditional virtues into weaknesses. For the bypassed garrisons, the war's end brought not relief but profound confusion. At Rabaul, General Imamura and Admiral Kusaka formally surrendered on September 6, 1945, aboard HMS Glory. But they were surrendering forces that had not been militarily relevant for over a year, going through formalities for an outcome that had been decided long ago. Many smaller garrisons experienced even stranger endings to their war. On Anatahan Island, 32 Japanese soldiers refused to believe the war had ended and continued fighting against no one until 1951, 6 years after the surrender. They maintained strict military discipline throughout this period, conducted regular patrols, prepared defensive positions, and awaited an American invasion that had been cancelled years earlier. These holdouts represented the logical extreme of the bypass strategy's psychological impact. They had been so thoroughly negated, so completely written out of the war, that they could not conceive of a world where they simply did not matter anymore, where their continued resistance was not even worthy of notice. Beyond the strategic implications, the island-hopping strategy inflicted a uniquely cruel form of suffering on Japanese forces. Combat, however terrible and deadly, at least offered meaning and purpose. Death in service of the emperor provided some transcendent justification for sacrifice. The bypassed garrisons were denied even this cold comfort. Private Kazuo Sakamaki, stationed at Wolei, wrote that soldiers did not fear death itself. What they feared was meaninglessness. Every day they woke up and conducted military drills for battles that would never come. They maintained weapons that would never be fired. They pretended to be soldiers when they were actually prisoners of their own making, trapped by duty and honor in a situation that rendered both meaningless. The medical records from bypassed garrisons reveal the human toll in stark clinical terms. Malnutrition affected 80% of troops by the war's end. Disease rates exceeded 60% in most locations. Psychological disorders were endemic, though rarely documented in formal reports. Suicide rates increased dramatically compared to combat units, as men found the burden of meaningless survival harder to bear than the prospect of death in battle. The island-hopping strategy fundamentally changed warfare in ways that extended far beyond World War II and influenced military thinking for generations. It demonstrated conclusively that controlling key geographic points did not necessarily mean controlling a region. Traditional military thinking was turned completely on its head. The Americans proved you could control the Pacific Ocean while ignoring its strongest defensive positions, routing around problems rather than solving them directly. The strategy showed that superior supply lines and industrial capacity could negate virtually any tactical advantage an enemy might possess. This was a lesson about logistics defeating valor, about industrial power overwhelming fighting spirit. Time became a weapon in ways military theorists had not fully appreciated before. By accelerating their own operations while simultaneously slowing enemy responses, Americans turned the simple passage of time into a strategic advantage that compounded daily. Most importantly for future military planners, the island-hopping campaign proved that psychological impact could exceed physical damage in strategic importance. Breaking enemy will and destroying enemy confidence could be more valuable than destroying enemy forces because demoralized troops are ineffective even when physically intact. In 1965, 20 years after the war's end, former General Hitoshi Imamura published his memoirs. After his conviction for war crimes related to the treatment of Allied prisoners, he had built a replica of his prison cell in his own garden and lived there until his death in 1968, donating all proceeds from his writings to families of Allied prisoners who had died under his command. His assessment of the island-hopping strategy was both professionally analytical and deeply personal. Japanese forces had studied Napoleon and Clausewitz and Sun Tzu, he wrote. They had prepared for every form of warfare they could imagine based on thousands of years of military history. But the Americans had created something entirely new that no one had imagined possible. Warfare by avoidance, victory through irrelevance. They had turned Japan's greatest strength, the willingness of soldiers to die for their positions, into Japan's greatest weakness. At Rabaul, Imamura had commanded 100,000 of Japan's finest soldiers. They had ammunition for years of combat. They had guns and fortifications. They had everything except an enemy willing to fight them. They could only watch as the war sailed past. They were an army of ghosts, haunting positions that no longer mattered strategically, defending territory that had no value, waiting for battles that would never come. This was the American genius, Imamura concluded. They had made Japanese forces defeat themselves. Every day the garrison held its positions, it weakened Japan by tying down troops who could have defended the home islands. Every soldier growing vegetables at Rabaul was one who could not fight at Okinawa or Iwo Jima. The defenders were not defeated in combat. They were erased from relevance, written out of the war while still alive. Future military leaders, Imamura argued, should study the American island-hopping strategy not for its tactical brilliance, which was modest, but for its strategic revolution, which was profound. It proved that the best way to defeat an enemy position is frequently not to attack it at all, but to make it strategically irrelevant. The best way to win a war may be to redefine victory itself, to change the conditions under which success is measured. The bypassed garrisons terrified themselves with their own impotence, Imamura admitted. Japanese soldiers had trained their entire lives for glorious death in combat, for the honor of dying in service to the emperor. The Americans had sentenced them instead to meaningless life in isolation. There was no warrior code that prepared anyone for irrelevance, no tradition that taught how to maintain dignity when dismissed as unworthy of notice. The Japanese were warriors from an ancient tradition, Imamura reflected, fighting an enemy from the future who played by rules that had not yet been written. The Americans did not defeat Japanese strategy in the traditional sense. They made strategy itself obsolete by refusing to engage on terms where strategy mattered. This was the true terror of the island-hopping campaign for those who experienced it. It showed them that everything they believed about warfare was wrong, that all their training and tradition and courage meant nothing against an enemy who simply refused to fight on their terms. The most poignant testament to the island-hopping strategy's lasting psychological impact came decades after the war's end. Lieutenant Hiroo Onoda continued fighting on Lubang Island in the Philippines until 1974, 29 years after Japan's surrender. Deployed to Lubang on December 26, 1944, with explicit orders never to surrender or commit suicide, Onoda held out with 3 other soldiers until he was the last survivor, still maintaining his mission long after it ceased to have any meaning. On March 9, 1974, his former commanding officer, Major Yoshimi Taniguchi, flew to Lubang and formally relieved Onoda of duty, releasing him from orders issued 3 decades earlier. Onoda surrendered on March 10th with his rifle still functioning, 500 rounds of ammunition carefully preserved, and his 30-year-old uniform still intact. When asked why he had continued so long, Onoda replied simply that he had been waiting for the war to come back to him. He had never imagined it would leave him behind forever, that he could be so thoroughly forgotten that no one would even bother to inform him of the war's end. The Japanese were terrified by America's island-hopping strategy because it represented something fundamentally worse than military defeat. It represented meaninglessness on an existential level. Every military tradition, every cultural value, every strategic assumption had been turned against them or rendered irrelevant. They had prepared for a war of warriors and faced instead a war of engineers and logisticians who treated their elaborate island fortresses like obstacles to be driven around rather than enemies to be fought and overcome. Approximately 300,000 Japanese troops on bypassed islands did not just lose the war in any conventional sense. They were written out of it entirely, erased from relevance while still living. While they maintained their positions with perfect discipline, grew their pathetic gardens, and slowly starved, the war moved on without them. They were not conquered through force of arms. They were discarded as irrelevant to outcomes being decided elsewhere. In his final journal entry before Japan's formal surrender, Admiral Kusaka at Rabaul wrote words that capture the entire experience. The Americans had taught Japanese forces the cruelest possible lesson of modern war. There exists something worse than death in battle, and that is irrelevance in victory. They had been the emperor's finest warriors, reduced to growing sweet potatoes while the enemy sailed past toward the homeland. They had been prepared psychologically and spiritually to die gloriously in service. Instead, they lived meaninglessly, forgotten and dismissed. This was the ultimate weapon that defeated them. Not bombs or bullets or superior tactics, but obsolescence itself, being rendered surplus to requirements. The island-hopping strategy succeeded so completely because it attacked not Japanese positions, but Japanese purpose. Not bodies, but beliefs. Not fortifications, but fundamental assumptions about the nature of war itself. It turned the vast Pacific Ocean from a field of battle into a highway to victory, transforming Japanese strongholds from fortresses into prisons of their own making. The terror it inspired in those who experienced it came not from what it did to them, but from what it refused to do. It did not provide the climactic battle that Japanese warriors craved and trained for. It did not validate their sacrifice or acknowledge their courage. It did not even recognize their existence as worthy of attention. It simply passed them by with calculated indifference, leaving them to discover that the worst fate imaginable for a warrior is not death on the battlefield, but irrelevance on the sidelines. The warriors of the Empire of the Rising Sun discovered in the most painful way possible that the setting sun casts the longest shadows. In those lengthening shadows, forgotten armies slowly faded into nothing, defeated not by their enemies, but by their enemies' absence, by refusal to engage, by strategic indifference. They had seen the future of warfare with terrible clarity, and in that future they had no place at all. They were relics of an older age, obsolete before the war even ended, museum pieces in their own lifetimes. The Americans had not just won the war. They had made Japanese defenders irrelevant to its outcome, and that irrelevance was more crushing than any battlefield defeat could ever have been.